All right, here we are. We are on chapter 14 of Mara, daughter of the Nile. We're going to dive right in. This chapter is called Shadow of the Dead. There was nothing of the simple scribe about Lord Shefdu as he sat at breakfast next morning on the roof loggia of his villa on the Street of Sycamores in western Thebes. He was clad in a dressing gown of royal linen girdled with scarlet leather, and beside his chair was a table of carved Lebanon cedar bearing fruit, bread, cheese, and a lily-twined flagon of milk. A Cushite slave hovered in the background. Beyond the balustrade stretched the ample groves, gardens, and stables of Shefdu's town estate. They were extensive, but not so extensive as his ancestral holdings downriver, where acre upon acre of farmland, vineyards, pastures, orchards, grain fields poured their riches every year into his storerooms and purse. It was a monthly accounting of those riches that was being read to him now by the old man in an elaborate wig who stood beside the balustrade. Irenaeus, major domo of the entire domain since long before the death of Shefdu's father, Menqua. From your lordship's diaries near the village of Nekeb, 30 pounds of cheese, both white and yellow, and 20 beef for slaughter. Irenaeus' voice was like the rustling of a dried palm frond. In addition, 100 skins of wine have been brought upriver on your lordship's barge, hour of sunset, to be stored in your lordship's warehouses in the city of Thebes. But his lordship was not thinking of beef or wineskins, nor was he showing much appetite for the array of dainties on the golden platter beside him. While his long fingers crumbled the bread and toyed absently with the fruit, his mind was far away in the desolate wastes of the valley of the tombs of the kings. In one of the barren gullies of that wilderness was a certain pile of red granite boulders. It looked the same as the other piles tumbled here and there through the valley, as if at the whim of a destructive giant. But to Shefdu, it was not the same. Far below it, in vast and silent chambers hollowed out of the living rock, slept the one whose peace he must destroy, whose wealth he must steal, whose ka he must impoverish. The dread of it had lain like a stone on his mind since he had dragged that message out of a reluctant Mara. Though he had not let her see it, he hated and feared his task with all his heart. But it was not the crime she thought it, nor was it certain the guardian Kefs would rend his soul or even strike him blind. For there was one thing Mara had not known when she stormed and pled with him, and that was the identity of the royal slumberer. He was Thutmose I, father of the king, and of Hatshepsut. In life, his arrogant daughter had robbed him of his throne when he was ill and feeble. Would he not willingly be robbed once more in death, if his gold could overthrow her? The prince had vowed he would, and Shefdu believed. He had to believe, because otherwise... Shefdu shook away that otherwise, along with the memory of Mara's prediction as she clung to him in fear. Whatever the Kefs might do, he had no choice but to descend into the tomb and come out laden. This was the last great gamble he and Thutmose had agreed on long ago, and the time had come to try it. Everything else that could be done was done. Therefore, if the grain remained in the warehouses until such a time as I fear your lordship is not listening? Shefdu pulled his attention back to old Irenaeus' reproachful voice. Tell me that last again, please. According to the calculations of our river experts, who are never wrong, repeated Irenaeus patiently, this year's inundation will be a small one, resulting in poor crops and a scarcity of grains in the months to come before Mother Nile again sends her gift to Egypt. Therefore, if a portion of your lordship's wheat still in the warehouses were to remain there, it would command a far greater price next summer in the time of hunger. I understand, Save it by all means against the time of hunger. But do not raise the price, Irinamun. The people must eat, whether they can pay or not." "As your lordship wishes," Irinamun cleared his throat and rustled the papyrus. "However, we, sell much grain to the agents of Her Majesty for the palace kitchens." Sheftu shot a glance at the blandly innocent old face and hid a smile. "Charge what the buyer can pay. I leave it to your discretion." The old servant bowed and went on with his list without further comment, but Sheftu knew that a fresh stream of gold from Hatshepsut's treasury would soon be pouring into his coffers, unless indeed the treasuries belonged to Thutmose by next summer. He felt a tremor of emotion at the thought. After 6 long years, it was hard to believe that the end of all this was approaching. Yet the plans he and Thutmose had made so long ago were almost complete. The work almost finished. Hatshepsut's elaborate structure of power was now like a house set upon columns of sand. Enlisting Khofra to gain control of the army had further weakened the foundations. There remained only a few lords still stubbornly loyal to the queen. Out of fear for their own fortunes and futures, these must be won over by persuasion and by gold, the greatest persuader of them all. Sheftu smiled grimly, tossing bread to the pigeons strutting along the balustrade. His regard for his fellow man was not what it had been 6 years ago. He no longer believed, even in his heart, that there lived man or woman gold could not buy. Only their prices differed. These last cautious ones would cost a pharaoh's fortune, and a pharaoh must supply it, he who slept beneath that pile of boulders in the valley of the tombs of the kings. His thought had come full circle. For the 20th time that morning, Sheftu left his chair abruptly, and the pigeons scattered with a drumming of wings. Irinamun stopped reading, then began to roll up his papyrus. "My lord wearies of business," he said tactfully. "Indeed, the morning is too fine for it. Hey, when I was your age, shall I have the boat and the throw sticks ready to divert you?" "Nay, old friend. I've no time for hunting, but I pray you, let us finish these accounts another time. I must drive to the temple within the hour. Go below and tell the barber to make ready for me." As the old man turned down toward the stairs, Sheftu laid an apologetic hand on his shoulder. "Forgive my inattention, faithful one. I have much on my mind." Irinamun's face lighted hopefully. "Indeed, can it be that my lord has perhaps met some young lady?" "Young lady?" With some difficulty, Sheftu achieved a careless smile. "Patience, Irinamun. Some day, I promise thee, my mother's long empty place at the table will be filled. But at present, get thee gone now." "Young lady?" Turning irritably as the major domo hobbled down the stairs, Sheftu signaled the slave to pour him a cup of milk. But even the lotus twined around the flagon brought to mind 2 mocking eyes, blue as enamel under slanted brows. Why in Ammon's name must he think so continually of that waif? For a waif she was. Remember the marketplace at Memphis? Remember her waking on the boat, a smudge on her face and wild defiance in her pose? Yet a dozen times a day he found himself thinking of the fluid way she walked, dwelling, fascinated, on some elusive curve of her cheek or throat, becoming preoccupied with the shape of her mouth, and remembering far too vividly the yielding warmth of her in his arms. Osiris! He had all but made love to her last night in the tavern courtyard, all but forgotten she was unprincipled little vagabond bound to him only by a threat and a bribe. He must not forget. The maid could worm secrets from the Sphinx himself. His lordship set the cup down hard and descended the stairs. The devil! He had talked too much last night. Why not admit it? He, Sheftu the discreet. She knew far more than he had ever intended her to know. Yet he'd had to fight the urge to keep talking. "Have you not learned," he asked himself caustically, "not to trust every maid who weeps on your shoulder?" He walked down a corridor and through a richly furnished sitting room. as blind to their sunny, familiar comfort as he was deaf to the greetings of a couple of house slaves who wished him good morning as he passed. How easy it would have been, there in the moonlight, to throw away all caution, to hold her tight in his arms and whisper that she must not fear. No kefs would harm one who came only to carry the dead king's gifts to his living son. To tell her even the name of the royal slumberer and the place where he lay. Sheftu went cold at the thought. Had the maid bewitched him, that he could court destruction merely to dry her tears? He must come to his senses. He was acting as witless as that handsome young sentry of hers. But I fear I misunderstood. Does my lord wish me to return later? Sheftu swung around. He was standing in the middle of his own apartments, but had no recollection of arriving there than he had of the presence of the barber, though the fellow must have spoken before. He collected his wits with some difficulty, cursing Mara and his own befuddled senses. "Nay, I want you now, Thoth," he muttered, stripping off his dressing gown. "Prepare your razors at once. I am in haste." The feel of the cooling salves and the razor gliding over his chin restored a sense of normality to the day, and he was grateful for the barber's silence, which enabled him to compose himself. As the fragrance of the sandalwood from the last lotion rose on the air, Sheftu stood up, running a hand over his jaw. "You are expert as ever, Thoth. Send my dresser in at once, and tell one of the grooms to harness Ebony and Wind of Swiftness to my lightest chariot." 10 minutes later, Lord Sheftu spun out of the courtyard and down the streets of sycamores toward the river. Plumes tossed above his horses' sleek black heads. The sunlight flashed from his golden collar and from 1,000 bits of colored glass set into the spokes of his chariot wheels. Driving off the ferry into the crowded streets of eastern Thebes, he flung a handful of coppers to the expectant throngs of waterfront urchins, then turned into the avenue of sphinxes, which bisected the city and brought him straight through the tall bronze gates of the Temple of Ammon. He stepped down, looking for someone to hold the horses. The huge courtyard swarmed with beggars, hurrying priests, white-clad Thebans buying frankincense, and temple offerings for the hawkers whose booths lined the walls. Sacrificial fowls squawked and fluttered in their cages. Lambs bleated plaintively. The smell of dust, animals, and sacred unguents mingled with the fragrance of a mass of fresh lilies on a flower seller's stall. "Hey, rejoice, master!" An old peddler had spotted him, set down his tray of consecrated bread, and hurried forward to catch the horse's reins. Tossing him a few deben, Sheftu made his way through the crowd and into the vast columned corridors of the temple proper. He found the priest he sought in a tiny anteroom off the shrine of Hathor. Jedet was a calm, portly man with a face like a moon, wearing the leopard skin of the Sem rank over his snowy linen robes. He was tying up onions into the hollow, circular bunches proper for the offering table. But at sight of Sheftu he paused. "Your lordship, rejoice!" He came forward at once, beckoning a subordinate to take over his task. There is some matter in which I may serve you?" It concerns the mortuary shrine of my father's tomb. I wish to increase the number of loaves and honey jars left for his ka each month. And in addition, 1,000 pardons, my lord. Pray come into more comfortable quarters, that I may offer you refreshment. My private chamber will serve." Sheftu followed the solid, stately figure out of the anteroom and down a hall lined with columns so massive they made even Jedet seem fragile as a splinter. Once the door of the little room had closed firmly behind him, the priest's impassive manner vanished. "Is it the signal? Shall I order the—" "Nay, my friend, the time is not yet. Indeed, the time will never be, unless you and I can perform one last impossibility." Sheftu sighed, the heaviness of his dread settling over him again. "Sit you down, Jedet. I will tell you what we must do." The priest's round face grew graver and graver as he listened. When Sheftu had finished, the little room was silent. Then Jedet rose ponderously and walked to the table, where he stood staring down at a pile of scrolls. "You have a plan?" he muttered. "We will need 2 diggers, men we can trust to be silent. Asher can find them. And to ensure their silence after the task is done, I will send them to my farthest estate to live in luxury and solitude until it is safe to loose them. I know a river captain who will arrange all that. As for your part, you must obtain the royal seal." Jedet swung around, eyes bulging. "But I cannot do that. Only the high priest of the city of the dead." "I know, but you must accomplish it somehow. Listen." Jedet listened, his expression changing slowly. He moved back to his chair and sank into it, his face intended, his voice low, as he put a question or two. At last he nodded. "I think it can be done, unless the guards at the valley—" He chewed his lip a moment, then shrugged heavily. "Ay, the plan is shot through with danger, but what is not these days? Better we die, my lord, than Egypt." He rose, touching forehead and chest. "I will do my best and send word. May the gods be with me." "Better we die than Egypt," repeated Sheftu to himself as he walked slowly back down the corridor. His eyes moved to the columns rising closest and massive on either side, stretching up and up until their carvings were lost in the dim reaches far above him. Old beyond memory, they were like Egypt itself, and they would stand unchanged 1,000 years more. Ay, and so would Egypt, no matter who had to die. One death alone would be enough, thought Sheftu grimly, that of a bejeweled and willful queen. He turned a corner and strode along a passage, neither noticing nor caring where it led. A few moments later, roused by the faint, irregular beat of hammers, he stopped and looked around him. Scowling, he realized he had strayed into the north wing. Not since last summer had he come to this place, and he had sworn then he would never come again. Slowly he pivoted to his left. There, only a few paces distant, was the entrance to the hall the first Thutmose had built as his kingly gift to the god. Sheftu walked toward it, his face set, the tap-tap of goldsmiths' hammers growing louder in his ears. At the tall doorway he stood, looking into a room flooded with sunshine. There in the middle of the roofless hall stood the queen's new obelisks. They were no nightmare then, but 700 tons of solid reality, monstrous needles of stone, 97 feet tall, soaring straight up into the brilliant sky. Sheftu's gaze traveled their length, part of which was at the moment obscured by scaffolding upon which gold workers swarmed. Well, he remembered the day last summer those shafts came floating down the river from the quarries on a flotilla of linked barges that seemed to stretch back to Nubia. No man had ever seen their like, for they had been cut from a single block of granite, without a seam or a joint. And because the queen was impatient, in only 7 months' time, there was an inscription on them swearing to it. How, in Ammon's name, had mortal hands accomplished it? It was all but impossible. So was raising the obelisks here with the temple itself. But here Hatshepsut wanted them, and here they stood, though it had been necessary to tear out many of her father's beautiful cedar columns and the whole roof of the hall to make room for them. Bitterly, Sheftu stared at the wreckage, remembering the crack of the lash and the ant-like swarm of men straining on ropes, dropping, dying, being trampled by their fellows, as with a shuddering, slow movement the great shafts rose into place, monuments to Hatshepsut's pride and malice. And now Sheftu's eyes moved to the scaffolding, through which a growing surface of pale yellow glittered in the sun. Furiously he turned and strode back down toward the courtyard, the faint tapping of the goldsmith hammers following him. Through the sound he could hear again Hatshepsut's voice. "My majesty is not pleased. The obelisks are mere dull stone and so unworthy of the daughter of the sun. I desire they reflect Ra's beams from every surface. They shall be cased in electrum. Extravagance upon extravagance until the very gods must be outraged. She would bring ruin upon the black land. The temple's dim quiet, ended abruptly as Sheftu stepped into the noise and dust and mingled odors of the outer courtyard. It was like plunging into another element, and the shock steadied him and dissipated his wrath. Fool, anger gets you nowhere, he told himself as he gathered his horses, Scarlet's reins, and popped the whip over their flank. Let her have her obelisks. She will soon have nothing else. As for the task ahead, think no more of it now. Jadette will arrange all. You have nothing to do but wait. That concludes Mara, Daughter of the Nile, Chapter 14.